speak up, very close friendships are more durable than the average romantic relationship. And because the thing that we care the most about in this debate is the welfare of children, people who didn't consent to be alive, who lack a choice or an agency in who their parents are, but are deeply shaped by the parenting choices that are made by their parents, the traumas, the way they come to see the world, the way that they are educated to see the world for life, then we think that it would be preferable if co-parenting were done by people in close friendships versus people who are in romantic relationships. Setup. What changes about the world? It is now no longer routine for people who are romantically involved together to raise their offspring together as co-parents. And that's obviously not an absolute norm, but it's no longer routine. The discussion that happens, because obviously the comparative debate is there are some people who presently do what we're advocating for, but most people do it in romantic relationships. We're advocating for the reversal of that. I don't think that would be contentious. We would say that the discussion that people enter into when they decide to raise a child together in our world will be done with a high level of solemnity and will be treated very, very seriously, because this is a huge commitment. This is committing to being in one another's lives for at least the time it takes to raise that child, but probably forever. And because this is now the norm, because this is the world in which people routinely do this, there are a whole bunch of unique social discourses that are surrounding which close friends you should select to have your child with, to co-parent with. People don't just do this with the average friend. The comparison that you ought make in this debate is very close friendships. People who are in friendships that have lasted for a long time, that are battle tested, that are well considered, whether those are appropriate to raise children together. That is the comparison you must keep in your mind for the rest of the debate. All right. First argument, why then are friendships more durable than the average romantic relationship? Why is durability the important axis in this debate? We would say that it is kind of the axis upon which the most important impacts in the debate time, which is how well children are raised, how well they are ultimately leave the process of being parented and being a child with. And we would say the harm happens to people when they have fewer parents, when they have no parents, they have one parent, or they live in homes in which parents are racked by personal disputes or where they are not focused on their children. We care about the impacts on children's rearing in this debate primarily because, as I presaged in my introduction, they didn't consent to be alive, they lack choice or agency, and they are shaped deeply by parenting choices. Why then? 6 reasons friendships are comparatively more durable. Firstly, sex complicates relationships in a way that is deleterious towards them ultimately being good for children, because there is a bias towards romantic intimacy. Sex is a thing that in an otherwise unhappy relationship keeps people in them. And the harm of that is children are exposed to environments in which they see their parents constantly fighting. They are ignored by their parents. They learn the power imbalances when people are being coerced into a relationship due to sex when they are otherwise unhappy. And in extreme cases, they are exposed to domestic violence as a result. Secondly, we would say that people opt into friendships more often for a couple of reasons. The first is that the expectation of monogamy means you have fewer options that you test of romantic partners because you're expected to commit to a romantic partner early by many social norms. You are expected to make a commitment to a single person quite early in your life, whereas with friendships, you have much more experience selecting the correct person, much more experience of friendships that didn't work, much more experience of friendships that do work, and you are constantly reassessing them. There is less of a barrier to end in friendship, so people are just more skilled at navigating the terms of whether or not a friendship relationship is healthy. That means that when people who choose to enter into relationships to co-parent, those friendships end far less often. They are selected well. They raise their children with deep attention towards that child. Thirdly, people selectively, only in our world, are guaranteed the option of opting into the process of choosing to have a child. This is a deeply consensual process because you are picking a friend to have a child with and you are opting into raising a child. In many parts of the world, people in romantic relationships where the de facto expectation is if you have sex, and then become pregnant, you will raise that child either yourself or with another partner, are coerced to having children by virtue of abortion laws that often ban people from terminating their pregnancies. They were coerced into engagements with people who they otherwise did not want to co-parent with or be around at all, which means that choosing to have a child in our world is guaranteed, but it's not guaranteed in the world of Team Negative, which means the relationships are just like a lot better. Fourthly, they're more likely founded on solid bases, shared interest, and hobbies, and terms of long-term compatibility. Because the reason people enter friendships is usually not that they're physically attracted to their friends, which is notably a thing that fades over time. It is an experience which wanes over time, versus something that increases over time, that your shared interests, your shared compatibility, your long-term notions of that you are interpersonally compatible. This is far less likely when the basis of you entering a relationship is deeply clouded by sexual attraction. Fifthly, the expectation of monogamous dedication and commitment made at a young age due to things like emotional intensity, due to things like the financial benefits, due to things like the social norms that you should get married young, are very fleeting and make people enter into relationships badly. Many romantic relationships become unpassionate at the point where you have children. People's looks degrades, they cheat, they become unhappy, and they have acrimonious divorces that devastate their children. This happens far less in friendships where conceivably you do so later in your life, conceivably you do so far more consensually. Sixthly, friendships rarely end for the reason that the parties in that friendship have had an acrimonious end to their relationship. And they usually end, for instance, because people move away, because their friendship circles no longer intersect with one another. This is an intuition pump that suggests that friendships rarely end for reasons that are harmful to children, but also because friendships are just more durable. And in a world of visual co-parenting, obviously, that reason doesn't end your friendship. Why then is the harm of broken homes worse for people who are romantically involved? And obviously, this is an effect which accrues in either world, i.e. relationships between parents are going to break down. That's going to harm children either. The claim we make is it's infinitely worse if your parents are romantically involved. And the key reason is because they're far, far, far more likely to have to go through a divorce process. And those processes are awful for children because kids often have to pick a side, because family courts often bias one parent or another, because the parents have an incentive to get custody and to pit children against one another, because they are often exposed to periods where they have to live together because they are still legally married, because of the complicated process of disaggregating their assets, where they are exposed to things like domestic violence, because they're exposed to their parents constantly fighting. At the worst, they're exposed to their parents ignoring them. In the world of negative, this happens in 1 in 2 relationships, 50% of relationships approximately, and in divorce. In our world, we contend it would be far less likely, but if it did happen, even if it happened symmetrically the amount of times, we would say it would be far better if your parents were friends, because at least you could pick another friend. At least your friends wouldn't end their relationship with each other. Absolutely. Bella's going to get on later in the speech to a benefit to queer and infertile people, but we are so, so proud to affirm.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. In order to continue the case for side negative, I'd like to invite the first negative speaker. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep, all good.
The reason that you might initially buy what you hear from First Affirmative about how long-term relationships are so perfect and harmonious and never end badly is because we have an incredible level of survivorship bias. When you end up not liking one of your friends, what you do is you drop them. But when you end up not liking your romantic partner, of course, you have to get a divorce and you publicize it. We just don't hear about long-term acrimonious friendship breakdowns because normally they don't involve property. Normally they don't involve children and custody. Normally they don't involve selling your house. So obviously you can just not catch up for coffee with your friend since high school because now you think she's really, really irritating, but that is something that they could never engage with. I have a couple of extraneous things to respond to, and then the rest of my responses will be integrated. Firstly, on whether friendships can be fit for purpose. I say 3 reasons that they can't. Firstly, because often you don't have it's actually not that common to have friends who you think are close enough to have these kinds of co-parenting relationships with, or that you have the right kind of relationship to have things with. Perhaps, for example, you and your friends do stupid stuff together or go out and get really drunk on the weekends, but that does not necessarily a good parent make. Secondly, because you can accrue all of the harms they tell you about a bad romantic relationship. I think that men who are violent and controlling are probably going to be violent and controlling towards the mother of their child, even if she is not their wife or something like that. I think that is probably really bad still. I don't think that violence is mitigated at all on their side if people are sufficiently bad, which I think you have to be violent, but also that your relationship can still break up. But then you're told, oh, well, you don't get a divorce. I think probably you still really care about custody. If you've been raising a child for 12 years, you obviously love it. You obviously want to see it. Whether you're even de facto relationships can end badly. I think obviously friendships can as well. But also they do not sufficiently engage with what happens with accidental pregnancies on their side. We hear, oh, maybe you don't have pressure to have children now if you're not in a romantic relationship. I think that's untrue. I think it's actually possibly good to have a norm of the person who you had sex with having to help raise the child. Okay, what do we care about in this debate? We care about what's good for society. I would just note no one chooses to be born, so we think that everyone who didn't consent to being alive, aka everyone, is important in this debate. But as part of that, we have 3 kind of subcategories of what we care about. Firstly, on the quality of parenting, so we also care about what is good for children. But secondly, the happiness of people in parenting relationships. And lastly, are the social impacts, so things like class considerations. In this debate, we've showed that at every stage of relationships, society gets worse. On to the first question, why parenting relationships are formed in a worse way. Quite a few reasons here. Firstly, we think that love is essential for establishing a norm of proper non-coercive relationships. Even if this is to a small extent, we think this is very important because all societies have some history at some point of highly coercive romantic relationships. We think that love is a very powerful overriding norm for dismantling this. And even if you say that people are explicitly consenting, we think that there's still a high amount of social pressure, which is much more strongly felt when you can't say, no, but mum, I'm not going to listen to what you say about my choice of partner because I love them, and instead it is a practical, pragmatic consideration. We think this is really important because changing this system obviously leads to immensely higher levels of happiness and things like that. We think that without love, you lose the tipping point that changes this damaging institution. This responds to a lot of their social discourse mechanisms that they give you. Obviously, this is hugely important because this probably hurts oppressed people the most. We think that is really bad. The second reason that we get better co-parenting relationships on our side is that their side solidifies heteronormative values because we think that overwhelmingly people are going to be pressured to have a mother and father figure for the children. We think that this is really bad because it ties into the weight of history, which has always demonized and hurt and misrepresented heterosexual couples, but also because it's really difficult to have children otherwise, simply it's challenged, the mechanisms of having children don't work for same-sex relationships. So we think it's unlikely that they will exist to the same extent. We think the impacts of this are that you lose modeling of same-sex relationships as a primary relationship for children who can go into the world and show that it is normal to be raised by 2 women or 2 men. You lose representation of queer couples. We think this is also terrible for class mobility, which is my third reason. We think already it's really bad that a lot of people get married kind of within their class and really make very strong class considerations. But we think that there are current countervailing pressures with romantic long-term life partnerships. These are things like beauty or the fact that you can just have a random chance meeting of love. Maybe you meet someone in a nightclub who's from a completely different atmosphere to you. We think this introduces class mobility and breaks up class hegemony, which is a positive thing. On their side, if this, assuming that this is a completely free relationship, which we think is a significant assumption, like I've said, we think that you're much more likely to want to arrange co-parenting relationships with someone like pragmatically, so someone as wealthy as possible who you think is going to be the best possible parent to your kid or give them the best possible opportunities. This cements class relationships and solidifies them and prevents exposure to people from different backgrounds, which we think is really important, even if it's like your friend's boyfriend or something like that. At this point in the debate, what happens? Firstly, we think these relationships are probably to some extent coerced. We think that you lose modeling of queer people and that class mobility is damaged. But even if you don't think any of that is important, here are 3 more reasons that this is important, that we think we get worse relationships. Firstly, because the marketship of relationship changes. Note that this is very responsive to what they said. We think currently there's a bit of a race to the bottom when you turn like 25 or 30, where everyone starts pairing off and trying to get married, and people play a game of musical chairs, really trying very hard to like select, to get the best partner before they all get locked down. Now, we think that starts much earlier because you lose the norm of having to have romantic experience before you make a lifelong decision. You're probably more likely to think about practical things like your fertility, your body clock. We think this is really bad because it locks people out based on the amount of social capital they have. Obviously, the most desirable people will get paired off into co-parenting relationships more quickly, but also that if you lose this norm of romantic experience, you might think that you can have children at a very premature age. You might think that you are like experienced enough perhaps when you're 22 rather than 28, which we think is bad. We also think that you're likely to make really bad decisions on your partner because you lose the norm of looking to assess things that are more that are like harder when you don't have mutual romantic feelings. So perhaps you think about like what career they would like to have later in their life or something like that, instead of at least having the mutual knowledge that you both want to spend your life together, that in 10 years you both predict that you would like to still be in love. We think that is bad. But even if none of that is true, we think that you're likely to increase the coercive, the amount of coercive surrogacy, because people are less likely to want to have like children themselves with a like non-romantic friendship. Otherwise, they obviously have to introduce sex into these relationships, which really damages their benefits. Secondly, why do we get worse relationships on our side? 4 reasons. Firstly, because you're likely to get worse, less romantic fulfillment. We think that this is immensely important because having children like takes up a huge amount of your time. This is why a lot of adults don't sustain very meaningful friendships after they have children. We think if you can't go looking for love, or at least you can't prioritize it, you're likely to feel quite unhappy and unfulfilled. This is obviously a significant harm and probably makes you a bit resentful towards your co-parenting partner. But secondly, you're more likely to be in unhealthy co-parenting relationships. In the status quo, when love stops between you, you probably know about it. You don't feel a cognitive bias that you think this is an investment that you've made where you want to chase your losses because you think, do you know what? I hate this person. I hate sharing a bed with them. I cannot abide being around them. We should get a divorce. We think that a lot of those pressures become worse on their side when you have made like a sensible, rational decision about who you're having children with. The third reason is that you're biologically more likely to resent someone that you have to spend an immense amount of time with when you don't have like all of the, at least initial hormonal benefits, but also like emotional and kind of memory benefits of having been in love with them. When you lose oxytocin, when you lose all of these like lovely memories of being in love and the rosy glasses, we think this is really harmful. Consider what it's like to be in COVID lockdown with a housemate that you despise, even if you really liked them a year ago. We think this is what it's like. People get locked into relationships, but they can never even point back to the fact that they loved each other, and they also can't tell their children that. But lastly, we think that love conquers all. We think that it provides unique reasons to compromise. It promotes tolerance and cohesion. We think that's an incredibly important benefit that they must lose on their side. So proud to oppose.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for the speech. In order to continue the case for side affirmative, I'd like to invite the second affirmative speaker. Here.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yes.
I resent the fact that this negative team thinks that romantic experience is the main thing that is able to help you in a relationship, help you be a good parent, and make you feel fulfilled. I think that is an affront to people who have never been in relationships. It is an affront to someone who is asexual and is still able to be a good parent. Obviously, we should not judge the quality of your parenting ability and the quality of your ability to love someone and stay in a relationship with them purely based on romantic love. I'm going to talk about 4 things in this speech. Firstly, the quality of parenting. Secondly, the importance of romantic experience. And thirdly, the idea of romantic fulfillment. But firstly, I'm going to do 2 pieces of extraneous rebuttal on the idea that we don't hear about long-term friendship breakdowns because they're not as clickbaity and because you don't have things like house attached to it and a mortgage and things like that and assets, which means that they are inherently not talked about much. 2 pieces of rebuttal. First of all, this means that my foot is in so much pain. Can I pause my speech? I've come. 2 pieces of response in terms of the material about long-term friendship breakdowns. The first thing is that the reason why we hear less about these kind of breakdowns is because they are far less complex. And that's because they don't have things like assets and property tied to them, which means that when a friendship breaks down, there are less ramifications of that breakdown, which means that even if they do happen just as regularly, they are perhaps less influential on that kid's life. But second of all, the reason why our team argues that actually these breakdowns happen less often is because you don't have the same amount of pressure to stay with your platonic friends, which is to say that you are continually reassessing your friendships with others, which means that you're less likely to have things like pent-up anger. Often the reason why relationships break down all of a sudden is because you have the experience of being coerced into staying with that person sexually. That thing doesn't happen when you're with a platonic friend, which means that you don't have pent-up anger, and that means that you're likely reassessing your friendships and reevaluating them constantly, which means that you have less cataclysmic breakdowns that this team is talking about. So first of all, the breakdowns are less cataclysmic when they do happen, but second of all, they are less likely to happen in the first place because you are reevaluating them, because there is less pressure and coercion to stay. Second of all, let's talk about the quality of parenting, because this negative team tells us that love is the reason why a lot of people are able to find happiness in their partnerships and make them meaningful. But secondly, they tell us that things like queer and class considerations are better under their side when we have this norm. First of all, if love is the be-all and end-all, I think it's true that love can be platonic, and often that platonic love is actually far higher quality. Think about the love that you have for your parents. There is absolutely no romantic attachment to that love, but they are someone you have constantly grown up with, and they are someone you were attached to. But even think about the love that you show friends that you've known since you were really young, or even friends that you have deep, meaningful connections with. These are people that you've opted into a relationship with, not because of their physical attraction, not because of the chemistry you have with them, but purely because they are someone who you get on with and you trust. That means the love you have with them is unconditional, versus the love that you have with someone who is a romantic partner. That love is often conditional on their physical attractiveness at best, but at worst, this love is conditional on the kind of ways in which they are able to please you physically, and that is obviously far more coercive and bad. Secondly, let's talk about queer couples underneath this issue, because I think it's ludicrous that this team thinks that the status quo is better for queer people. Obviously, it is far better when co-parenting becomes the norm for queer people, and that's for 2 reasons. First of all, it means that the idea of a nuclear family is dismantled. One of the reasons which queer people feel so uncomfortable in environments, particularly around education systems, is because they are singularly the only same-sex couple in that environment. When this norm changes and you start co-parenting, that doesn't mean you're co-parenting with someone who is the opposite gender to you. It means you're co-parenting with someone who is a close friend. And that necessarily means you have more same-sex co-parenting relationships, which obviously makes the norm easier for queer people. But second of all, even if you don't buy that, it just means that less people are coerced into having kids when they are in a romantic partnership. Often, a lot of the time, queer couples don't want to have kids because doing that for them is much harder, because it means like you can't just have sex and have a kid. You often have to go go through things like surrogacy or IVF or adoption, which means that opting into that process is far harder. This means there is less of a norm surrounding having kids in the first place. So when queer couples opt out of that process, they feel less isolated. Finally, let's talk about class considerations, because this team says that, well, you're more likely to just happen chance meet someone who's from a different class to you because there's that physical attraction versus your friends you meet in scenarios that are similar to you. I think this is deeply uncomparative because I think that you often meet romantic partners in places like your university or your workplace purely because that's the place you spend the most time. Maybe in a minutia of cases, you meet people happen chance who are different to you, but I think this is a huge burden for that other team to rest their hat on. But second of all, I think that friendships are actually the ones that are more likely to be diverse. And that's by reason that you have sheer volume, far more friends. And that means that the chance of your huge volume of friends being diverse is far more likely than your partner being diverse because there are more of them. That means when you opt into a co-parenting relationship, you are able to pick from a much broader range of people. So if this team really cares about diversity benefits in class, obviously it is better on our side. But note the fact we don't have to defend the burden of increasing the class mobility and people's ability to have a kid with someone from a different class to them. That is not our burden. We are simply proving that the quality of parenting for children is far better and to our side because of all the reasons we told you at Oscar. Next, let's talk about the idea of romantic experience and whether or not this is important, because that speaker spends a huge amount of time talking about the importance of romantic experience in having a kid. The first thing I'd say is this is a hugely reductive way to view experience, in that I think there are a broad range of ways you're able to get relationship experience that aren't just from having a romantic partner, but also I would argue that the experience you get from a friendship is often far better by virtue of the fact that your communication with them is actually often of a higher quality. The reason that's true is because you're less coerced to stay with a friend because you don't live in the same house as them, because you aren't having sex with them. And so that means that you're more likely to have tricky and difficult conversations because you know that you can just walk away. Whether with a partner, you don't have that ability to walk away because they're someone who you are romantically tied with, you have a chemistry with, and it feels far worse when you leave them, which means you're more inclined to stay. Whether a friendship, when it is on the rocks, it is far easier to say, sorry, the reason why it's good that you're able to leave, because I noticed that James is like, oh, that's crazy. It's obviously good that you're bound to that other person. No, the reason why it's terrible to be bound to a romantic partner is because things are always going to get pent up. You are always going to get angry. The problem is that when you get angry in a romantic partnership, everything blows up in a cataclysmic reaction. And that's what leads to huge amounts of divorces 10 years into a marriage. The impact that kind of divorce has on a kid is so much worse than the impact of a friendship breakdown, because you don't have the complexities of things like having a house together. You don't have the complexities of having your whole entire life rather than just your child tied to each other. There is a reason why kids who have divorced parents have a huge amount of trauma versus kids that have been co-parented in, obviously in the status quo minutiae of cases, don't have that kind of trauma attached to them. But we would argue, as we told you, at Oscar, that the kind of reliability of friendship is so different by virtue of the fact that you aren't coerced into staying because of that romantic attraction. You aren't coerced into staying because that romance is the only chance you have, for example, of having sex. If it's a friend, that is someone who is more replaceable in that you can get different things from different friends. That is of a benefit for your child because you're more likely to be communicative. You're more likely to opt out when you need to opt out. And those benefits to the kid are astronomical.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for the speech. In order to continue the case for the negative, I'd like to invite the second negative speaker. Here.
That second speech introduces a lot of unwelcome questions in this debate, because it was unclear to me whether these aromantic couples were going to be living in the same home after that speech. And if they weren't living in the same home, I had a variety of other logically subsequent questions that I think cast massive doubts over their side of the house. Questions like, do you have one person living in another person's house, like in their lease, just by the grace of their goodwill? Do you have some situation by which the child is moving between homes and moving between school districts? Why would any parent have an incentive, given that parents clearly want to keep control of their children after the divorce, to just leave the child with the other parent, especially when they were investing into this huge thing when they didn't have that added reason of romanticism? All of those questions were ones that needed to be answered by affirmative, given that the conclusions that were risen from them were ultimately odious. I have a few different questions in this speech. The first one is about friendships, their durability, and how we get into these relationships in the first instance. The second is on the vicissitudes of relationships, and the third will be whipping some unresponded material from Liv. First thing, friendships are more durable. What do they say here? The first thing is an intuition pump, because I'm going to tell you it's untrue. 70% of first marriages survive, and I think that you just ultimately, how many people how many people here have had a close friend throughout all of their life thus far? How many of you in this room have had more than one or two of those close friends? I didn't think that they were that common, and if they were common, I didn't think that they were as numerous as affirmative wants to suggest. The next thing that I'm going to say is that I think that they have a big problem with survivorship bias that second gets tangled up in trying to address. Because the problem is we weren't more adept at managing friendships. We were never more adept. The moment you started to dislike your housemate, you started to look for an exit strategy. The moment you disliked your friend, you started winding back the amount of interaction that you had for them. And the reason that was really problematic come the late case shift in second affirmative case was because the win conditions that they set up for first affirmative were longevity, were things like stability. Those were the things that they spent the brunt of that speech describing why they were good for a child. Questions to me became yeah, look, I think you still probably have, to a degree, tied assets, the reason, and this was the only substantive response we got from second, that romantic relationships were in the news because they're messy with children and assets, probably the case now with non-romantic relationships. It was unclear to me why that was ever going to be better, because you didn't get more longevity. Note then, if you get rid of that win condition of them, what that collapses down to is just, divorce is actually easier when it does happen, and that becomes the core of their case, which I'll get to soon. But I'm going to push back on friendships a bit more, because I frankly don't think that friendships are in any meaningful way fit for the purpose of the task as they want to glide over and suggest that it is. Think about, panel, the genealogy of friendship. Why are you friends with the people that you were friends with? I thought that often it was the case that your point of connection with them was far narrower than what you needed from someone who you were going to raise a child with. You met them through an activity or a part of your life, and they were cordoned off into that part of your life. You didn't feel the need to share with them intimacies and the types of particulars that would be necessary to get on with you in your long period of life. I tell my boyfriend things that are incredibly important about trauma that has happened to me that would meaningfully impact my decision to have children if that ever accrued. You don't have the same types of obligate intimacy with close friends. And I'd say one of the defining points of friendship intimacy is that you can have that friendship without having those requirements or those obligations of sharing. I think if you start to share or treat friendships with the level of intimacy or closeness that is required of these relationships, you start to brew and produce a lot of the problems that they wanted to misidentify as innate to romance and are actually innate to the complicated endeavor of child rearing, which is why friendships were not going to work like they said they were going to. Note that, for example, if you're just say the average man in the average society, maybe you have friends from playing footy, maybe you don't even have that many really close friends. It's unclear to me how you were ever going to be able to form one of those really positive relationships from your vast raft of people who you were going to know. I think if longevity is their win condition, they fail. But first affirmative does a couple of other things. Suggests that, you're going to have this huge, really big discussion about children. It becomes more solemn. I thought that solemnity about whether or not you would have children was also the status quo in romantic relationships. Note that they say, there are going to be these other norms around talking about it. You can't fiat in positive norms. We can show why bad norms would exist around your side of the motion. But note that I think that actually gets absolutely worse when you consider things like accidental pregnancies. Because if it is more solemn, if it is more contractual, what happens when people are impregnated in romantic romantic relationships when they are teenagers, when they are young adults, it's like unclear to me. That I think that's probably going to be a lot worse, and you're far more likely to have things like coerced abortions. You're far more likely going to have things like discrimination against single parents. Note, I found it offensive when First Affirmative said that single parenting was bad and led to bad outcomes for children, like a backstab in their case that they can't stand by. The next thing that we tell you about why this is so bad is class. And second thinks that they can get away with saying, oh, no, it's uncomparative because it only changes thing a bit, without realizing that that was the framing that Liv gave you about how it's now an absolute class incentive versus a class incentive that is not so absolute, and about how that hegemony has unique problems. But the next thing that they said is, oh, you're going to have a big raft of friends, as if just the bare fact of knowing more people, who, by the way, they never prove are not going to be from your class, means that you would ever select one for any other reason besides those that were personally motivated, besides those that Liv did an excellent job at stepping out. At that point, I thought we were up on class selection questions. Then they say, oh, it's actually good for queer people. But no, you can't fiat in the reduction of the nuclear family. In the model, it says these are still partnerships, still two individuals. I thought that what you had now was a greater incentive, a greater push of children need a mum and dad. There's nothing stopping you from doing it. You can go off and be gay on the side. If me and my boyfriend were to have a child, I think that is the type of pressure that you were put under. You were further kept apart, and your type of relationship is never held up in society as the central or the most important model for relationships. That was going to be bad. They didn't respond onto our material about like why you lose a path to potentially get relationships that are less coerced. They don't respond to our material about races to the bottom or why it's difficult to assess. At the end of this point, I think it's comprehensively true that friendships are not fit for purpose and that you are going to choose these relationships bad, which put us way ahead. But what else do they tell you? Because I alluded to earlier that their case collapses to divorce is going to be really bad because now you are angry and resentful and you can't work things out. Panel, they don't prove that. The best that they do is gesture to sex and say that sex is complicating, which I'll respond to like discreetly in a second. But beyond that, I thought that you could be really angry at your friends. You could learn to loathe them. And that most importantly, you still had a shit ton to lose. You had every incentive to throw mud. You had every incentive to militiate for the type of life you wanted for you and your child. And in fact, less incentive to cooperate, less happy memories to mitigate those things, less any positive reason to get along with. So what do they say? Divorce is so much worse for that anger, which they don't prove, despite the fact that longevity was held up as their win condition at First Affirmative. Already a loss there, but I think that we say that love's the type of thing that makes you hold on a bit longer, gets children out of the house. That was the type of thing that was going to be good. You got divorces later in life comparatively to when you were going to get these friendships to break down, especially if you were unable to decide it, like Liv says. They said sex complicates, like newsflash, sex is going to happen anyway. It's going to happen potentially in those relationships accidentally if you're cohabiting or interacting. It's going to happen outside of them and change your incentives about what city you want to live in, who you want to know. Those are the types of things that make you make rash decisions which harm your life, which harm the life of your child. The final thing I want to point to in this speech is the massive material from Liv that gets unresponded to. Things about how you don't have time for romantic relationships anymore. Things about how serotonin and oxytocin stop you from resenting, which is why romantic relationships exist in the status quo. For those unresponded reasons and far more, we are proud to take this debate.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. In order to continue the case for side affirmative, I'd like to invite the third affirmative speaker. Here.
Hello, sorry, can you hear me? Sorry, it's been a bit of a disaster from us.
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. I'm going to start by asking the question, what is important in this debate? Because side opposition spends a lot of time proving things that are frankly irrelevant. They start by saying, this changes the norms about who can access relationships that are kind of good. And there are two ways of proving this. Apparently queer relationships get better, which is clearly on the outside of the house. When you destroy a norm that the nuclear family needs to be solely based around romantic interests, when queer people overwhelmingly form close platonic bonds, this literally legitimizes the them and allows them to happily form a family now. So that is clearly under our side. Their second push is on class, which is bizarre because I just don't think it changes anywhere near significantly enough in this debate. Friends often still transcend class boundaries. Like they're examples themselves of you find friends as colleagues at work. Work isn't a perfect reflection of your class. People tend to get degrees and find close friends at university. They tend from poor classes still to be able to access jobs with a diversity of people's backgrounds in there. It's unclear, even if you didn't believe that friends still to a degree transcend class, that their comparative is any better. Their comparative is supposedly love is what allows you, despite any class boundaries, of forming close romantic connections, which just fails any reality check of the vast majority of people you're exposed to are people of similar class. The very mechanism that they give about why your friend's going to be of the same class as you is so you're going to form attraction to those people as well. It's unclear that you're ever exposed to people outside of your class under their words as well. But even if you were to some extent, it's just unclear that this is meaningful. Like, it just is so much less tangible than a child whose education has been ruined because their family is going through a breakup, who has to literally choose, do I go with my mother or my father? Because there is a tremendous custody battle. It's just way more obvious that our stuff is more important. What else did they say was maybe important in this debate? They say, look, it's about the intensity of the relationship. It's about romance, allowing people to feel closer. And I'm like, we still get romantic relationships, right? In the same way that they still get people forming friendships, we just have romantic relationships where you don't have a family and you don't have kids around those relationships. And it's unclear that that reduces by a significant margin. They certainly never prove it does. But at worst case, and I think to some extent there will be slightly less of them, firstly, you get more close friendships. It's unclear that you don't feel amazing emotions from close friendships as well. Maybe slightly different emotions, but still particularly important ones. So the second thing is, if it is true, our analysis, that we get more stable relationships that are more durable, then we get the far bigger emotional impact on parents, that they have a child that they care about deeply, that does not suffer through anywhere near the same pains that they otherwise would have suffered through. And if we just simply prove that you get less breakups in the first place and they're less serious, that is a far more significant benefit to parents than they could ever prove in this debate. Again, certainly more tangible than it's about the intimacy of this romantic relationship rather than the platonic emotions that are also very important to you. Super bizarre. And the last random push in this debate is about like the number of parents, but like this is a new norm. And presumably people will just, who still want families, will now seek close friendships to form those families with instead. That's exactly what the status quo is for people that engage in romantic relationships to form families. So it's a bit unclear that the number of parents reducing is in fact a harm if it occurs in the first place. Again, there's a lot of proof here that goes unresponded to. Last, miscellaneous rebuttal to the introduction of the prior speaker, which is just like, well, do they live with each other or not? Are cases that parents would make that decision. They probably have greater flexibility because there's less of a norm under our side. Who knows? They would probably do what's best for them and what they feel is more confident in ensuring the best outcomes for their kids. Unclear why they somehow irrational or stupid and can't make that decision. Why then do we handedly take this debate? Because none of this stuff mattered. What mattered was the benefits to kids on the ground, that they could access a meaningful education from parents that could dedicate the time to them, when they did not have to experience the violence or the discord of a family that was dysfunctional, that they didn't have to be constantly distracted by the yelling of the parents, feel like they had to leave home, had to not even just leave home, just like have to go out with friends all the time to try and not be in their home environment. That was a far more conducive environment to kids succeeding in life, kids not having bad influences, the fact that their parents had to cope with this type of discord through things like drugs. So why did we achieve that very tangible and very real benefit in this debate? First, we explained it was way less likely that parents break up under our side of the house. We say first that there is likely to be a significant amount of discussion between friends in this new norm, and they correctly point out that this currently happens in romantic relationships. Yes, we are simply proving that it will also happen under friendships. They say, but you can't have as intimate a conversation to kind of talk about exactly how this would look like. I just find it bizarre that they have the imagination to recognize that you can share finances, but not the imagination to recognize the new norm would promote and encourage you to also share intimate conversation in the same way that you might talk to your parents in a very platonic way, but still about very close and very personal and very private things about your relationships. Their second push is like, And the second push, I think, is to our actual offensive material. Our offensive material starts by explaining that sex washes over what often is incredible amounts of conflict, meaning that in the short term, people form these families, they have these child, and they cannot dedicate to these relationships. It is unsustainable. Their response is, but if they're likely to be violent and bad people, they're always going to be bad people. It's just unresponsive, because our analysis is that interests, firstly, wane less over time than attraction does. It's a more sustainable emotion that allows for long-term relationships, because whereas looks fade over time, whereas emotional maturity means people feel less attraction as they get older, the same is not true for interests and for friendships. But the second argument that we make is that it is a less emotionally intense. It is less emotionally charged, which allows people to more rationally opt into these relationships. So their response is just not specific to the analysis that we give here. Their better analysis is, this is actually bad analysis, never mind, is to explain that love is a tool that is used to counteract external coercion, which is bizarre. It's just implausible that if you're going to get into a forced marriage, that the narrative of love is the thing that stops that forced marriage. But second, you're presumably still under our side, not coerced into those things because it's against the norm that this person isn't a friend of yours. So it's unclear that that isn't also just totally symmetric. And then we just provide more substantive material to explain that the chances of you getting into good relationships are much better under our side. You opt in better because you have way more choice of your friends than you do of your romantic attractions. You are in far greater control. You have way more experience, more exposure. The vast majority of people have a small handful of romantic relationships across their lives. They form many, many more friendships because you do not need to have a single romantic partner, you can have many. So you have more information, you have more experience, you have more understanding of who will work for you and who will not. And our final response is you opt in better because you have less unplanned families. Their response is, but like what happens if you have an unplanned family in a romantic relationship under your side? I'm like, well, what do you think happens in the status quo when you don't want to have a family with someone? It's the exact same, like a totally bizarre argument. The last thing, though, is we prove that these individuals leave better under our side. They can reevaluate friendships more calmly, and because they have so many more friends, you're not forced to have a single romantic partner. It means that you are able to still form friendships and distance with the friends that you're having a family with if you cared about that so deeply. So it's important that people stayed in these relationships for the right reasons, which is what occurs under our side, and that is why we handily win on this first question. Perhaps most importantly, though, the breakups are much better under our side. Their core argument here is that there is a survivorship bias, but we explain to you that you can have other friends, whereas you cannot have romantic partners, which is what makes these breakups so bad and so emotionally intense under their side. And that is why, even if you believe that there are slightly less breakups under their side, those breakups genuinely devastate the lives of these children because they are so much more emotionally intense. They lead to the custody battles that actually ruins these children's lives. It's off those metrics we've been this debate.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. In order to complete the substantive part of opposition case, I invite the third neg. Here. Sorry, I expect to pause the recording at this point. Sorry. There. Anyways, now go the affirmative reply speaker to complete the case for affirmative and to conclude the debate. Here.
Audible?
Yes, you are.
Take a second to stop and reflect on what's comparative in this debate. It's preferable for children to be raised well. Children are raised well when they receive constant attention, and the co-parents are likely to stay together in a mutually happy and strong way. Which side delivers this best? Negative's primary strategy here is to point out a set of uncomparative reasons that friends are bad. They say, well, exposure to people like your housemate makes you hate people. You might disagree over religion. Newsflash, negative team. These things all occur in romantic relationships. These are not comparative reasons. These are not reasons to not prefer friendships. They say you don't love your friend in a way that's chemical. Bella at second affirmative, despite her foot being bleeding onto the carpet, I think quite beautifully establishes that you can love your close friends in a way that is equally chemical. There's absolutely no response from negative. I think because they know it's true. First negative concedes that oxytocin that comes from romantic relationships and sex is fleeting. And we say that's exactly the problem, because when you are in a loveless relationship, when that oxytocin wears off, when that person's looks wears off, those relationships end terribly. They insist that it's not fit for purpose, but they don't explain what purpose that it's not fit for, and they never respond to Bella's speech. There are three things in subsequent that they decide to ignore. Firstly, our explanation that because you have more friends, because you have more aggregate experience navigating friendships, that people are better informed about which people they select to be parents compared to the pressure to enter a romantic relationship at a young age, to do so quickly, and on factors that are likely not going to be a part of your calculus in 10 years' time. For instance, that person's physical attraction. Third negative all but admits this. Importantly, you now don't select people because of that fleeting physical attraction, because you had sex and because your state makes abortion illegal, because you're in a literal arranged marriage. Those things make the lives of children worse. They appear to also believe, clearly, if you believe our analysis about aggregate knowledge, that falls to us. It is less emotionally intensive because there is more flexibility and you're likely to end less emotionally. Finally, they willfully choose in this debate to misunderstand the term durability. It's not just literally staying in a relationship, but staying in a way that is like productive for a child. When people stay in coerced relationships because they are thinking about sex and not the welfare of a child, children's welfare suffers. It's not contradictory to our case. So parents that are friends are just less likely to end badly, and that delivers our benefit to children. Children have worse lives in their world. Their parents are far more likely to end in divorce and to end up in broken homes. And that's just bad. And that delivers our benefit. They never really get around the harm of divorce in this debate. They suggest maybe there'll be some more asset entanglement because you still have to live in the same house or whatever. But it's obviously less because exponentially fewer people are in the legal contract of marriage, which takes an extensive period of time to aggregate and disaggregate, delivering our harm of people living in unhealthy homes that are often physically violent for extensive more periods of time. Abuse is also just more likely in relationships that end badly but stay for longer. That question is clearly a hemorrhage for Team Negative, a clear win for us. All they could do then is leverage their queer and class claims with both. Obviously, a world without the nuclear family that tells people their value is tied to their reproductive capacity obliterates many queerphobic norms. We explained this to Bella, and they just were like, oh, whatever. Queer people adopt more. They're more able to celebrate non-heteronormative, non-biological relationships. Clearly, act material. I don't even know where they brought it into the debate. The class stuff is at worst symmetric because, as we observe, your friends and romantic partners are chosen from disproportionately the same class setting. There's no difference here. But at best for us, it's flipped because as you have more friends, because they come from far more diverse places, they are more likely to cross class lines, delivering us that claim and not them. I don't think there's anything left in this debate that is comparative from Team Negative. Clearly, you want to default to the analysis that was comparative.
All right, in that event, I'm also going to record the oral adjudication. I hope it will be accessible at some point. So I'll talk about the call and then we can move on to the details of the debate. So we had a split decision on favor of side affirmative. For both of us, it was incredibly close. And so let's try to discuss what actually happened on the debate to just lead to this kind of cause. So firstly, I think it was around the quality of relationship because both of the teams conceded that that is how it would trickle down to the level in which you could provide for the child, because probably the stability in that relationship or a proper bonding in that relationship would also influence the parenting within that kind of situation. So I think a couple of things here. Affirmative side's push here was you are going to have a lot more options. You can choose from variety of people in that relationship. Second, friends are not confined to one specific center of romance. So they are likely to be broad and different types of friendship relationship where you are able to take into account a lot of practical considerations, and probably you're likely to prioritize a lot of who you think is going to be best for the child as opposed to your emotions there. Side opposition says that emotion is what is able to keep you going through a lot of difficult times. The second thing that they say is the fact that you have emotion with someone associates a lot of positive emotions that follow after that emotions because of the memory of that emotions. The second thing that opposition says in regards to keeping them with that relationship is in regards to contractual obligations, things like mortgage, and probably things like some kind of commitment, like sharing resources, but also living in a system which doesn't allow them to get out of it, allows them to probably commit more to that kind of relationship. I don't think it was that much coercive as opposition painted out as. I think opposition did reasonably talk about how it is accessible for these people to get out of this relationship if they want, but oftentimes they need an incentive to stay together. So how did I weigh these two claims? So I think on a couple of things. I do agree with side opposition in regards to the point at which the romance starts. Both of these people are committed to that relationship to the point that both of them are in love with each other and continually able to provide for each other. What I'm slightly not on terms with is in regards to the long-term sustainability of that relationship, because the analysis on opposition on here is because there was positive memories associated with that person that's going to lead to future associations that is likely to keep that person here. The question is whether or not these people are going to be happy in that keeping. So on that context, affirmative says a couple of things. As much as you have emotional investment on that relationship, you're also likely to be affected in a negative way once that wears off. But second, you are also likely to have negative sentiments associated with that romance. For example, things like probably like dying out of that romance, falling out of that relationship, some kind of problems in miscommunication and stuff like that. So I wanted to gauge if it is equally likely with the friends so that we could see the viability of both of these relationships. On this, a couple of things that affirmative does. Firstly, because of the larger access to choice and broad areas of ways in which you could maneuver friendship. There's two things here. One, you choose from large number of friends. The context is because it's easy to find friends. But again, it's not likely to be true. The next context that proposition says is we're likely to choose ones that are very close friends. So it's again likely to be limited again, though it's like broad variety of friends. So the context here was I'm still more convinced that you are likely to have more close friends that you could rationally consider as opposed to close partners. Because opposition's consideration here was we are going to be slightly more emotionally involved when picking an emotional relationship. And that also probably means that you are likely to be irrational in that picking of that relationship. And that's probably the way through like navigating the class divide on opposition, because if people are rationally considering their own biases and perceptions, then they are likely to choose the people from the same class as well. So I think on that regard, I want to look at why that decision making is likely to be good or bad. So on this, a couple of things here. One, in regards to friends, they talk about how they are equally likely to share different kind of memories, but they don't come with baggage. The reason for that is because there is no emotional component involved to the degree that you depend on this person. So I think analysis on first affirmative was around power dynamics. They talk about how there is an explicit power dynamics which is set by the conditions of the relationship, especially by the like emotional dependency, but also the situation in which this relationship is set. That is to mean the ability for these people to get out of this is something that is limited there. The second condition then is whether this is good for the child, because opposition says this is likely to be good for the child. If you don't get out of this relationship early, you're likely to commit to child rearing and a lot of other processes that follow. So, and also the contractual obligations. So I think a couple of things. One, this requires you to prove that the life when these parents abandon the child is going to be worse than when they live with this kind of differences or struggles. Because the fact that they are thinking about getting out of this relationship probably means that they are in that kind of dilemma where they have to consider whether they want to stay within that relationship or whether they want to get out. So within that kind of paradigms, I think proposition is able to talk about some of the spillover effects. Like, for example, you're likely to have fights there. You're likely to discuss these things that is likely to have an effect on the child's health, to a certain degree, mental health perhaps. Opposition class is if they get separated, it's also going to impact them. But the analysis on this was slightly limited. The context was an abandoned child probably going to suffer from certain kind of context. The context here is, I'm not entirely clear as to why this child is likely to be abandoned, except in situations like divorce, or probably except in situations where his friends just move out. So the second thing is, whether or not you are likely to be committed in that relationship in the long run. Because the fact here is the romantic association within those type of people are subject to change. The reason why I'm more likely to believe this argument is because rational consideration of who is going to be best for the child wasn't factored into your original decision making. So it's based on love. That is why it's important on you to make how that love builds up over time, or probably just stays constant at least, or probably even if it decreases, allows the support for that child to increase over the time. So I think on that paradigm, I think it's slightly more limited on affirmative. Doesn't mean to say that it's less persuasive, but the fact is the extent of analysis provided was around the pragmatic factors, which I didn't think was a substantial analysis, because while it does prove the viability of that relationship existing, it doesn't make the happiness to exist with it. The fact is you are there because these pragmatic factors are there. So the happiness has to somehow be met into that also in regards to how you have like larger shared history in regards to relationship. The second argument that opposition does is around class considerations. And this is quite a good argument, I'd say. But again, like it is like an argument with double-edged sword or stuff like that. So let's try to look at how it works there, right? So the case on opposition is because you are likely to prioritize people from similar race, similar culture, and similar social status, that oftentimes limits the access, like for example, of this kind of relationships, or like friends and relationships like that, to be just supported of that class divide. So you are likely to just get confined on that class. The contest from prop is like it happens on both sides, and that's definitely not enough. The reason is because opposition says there's an irrational factor called love that is able to break through these kind of barriers where people are able to make considerations about who to marry and who not to. The question is whether that is good, because there are two harms and two benefits from it. One benefit is you get probably better class differences. For example, one person from one class is likely to be able to engage with person from different class. The contest then is that was not the rational priority of that person. The fact is, it makes it even more likely that when that oxytocin wears off, this person is more likely to regret that decision. So the context here was with friendships, maybe probably you are not likely to break those class barriers as often, but it is also important on op to mechanize why that is good, because it's not that class barriers in as isolation. It is comparison of that division of class against what happens after in that interclass marriage or probably interclass association that you talk about in those cases, right? So the context is, it is not just enough, like basically about debate, it's not just enough to suggest that these classes are less likely to be segregated. It's also enough to show why that interclass concept of that marriage or probably this relationship is going to be better in the long run. The next thing is, I think opposition is probably doing good on this particular point. The context here was this relationship is more deeper than the relationship that you have with friends. The outcome of that is you are likely to be more forgiving towards your partner and more forgiving or more giving towards your child as a result of this. So I think on situations where it actually works, this relationship is probably better than a relationship with a friend. The context here is friends can come in and out. A lot of the times it's going to be difficult to probably organize a kind of negotiation around it. So I'll talk about mitigation on affirmative about this, but also in what layers they are able to at least come close to this claim on their side. Firstly, on mitigation, I think proposition on the first themselves are able to describe that a lot of the times when you start having relationship when friends are likely to choose other friends, then there is going to be a lot of discussions about who to choose. There's going to be a loss of access of information systems in regards to this. I think this is gradually developed over time, so I cannot credit them entirely of that. But what I can do is they are likely to reassess and reflect on the quality of their relationships. So even if they shift from one friendship to other, it also probably means that you are likely to move into a better friendship over time for that kind of relationship. The reason for that is they talk about in their first affirmative that you learn from this kind of relationship and reflect back. On opposition, whether you learn from that relationship or what happens there. So I think the cost here was cost of divorce was proved to be high. I think on either side they agreed about this question, but they are also likely to retain that relationship for the longer time. So it is also contingent on how you get your choice right the first time as well, or probably how you are able to follow through on that promise. So the way in which opposition was able to follow through was the mechanism of depth. The emotion is so deep that you are likely to stay in this relationship for a longer period. So I think this is a likely argument. But the second step from that is it also makes it difficult for people to come out of relationship when it becomes pragmatically required for them to. So I think on that, I think whether or not opt-out was necessary, because opposition says opt-out was bad. Proposition said opt-out is easy on our side. that is, I think, on both sides, good and bad, because the context here was the future of the child, but also the nature of relationship. So the context here was Prop was able to prove that getting in on that relationship for a longer period when you don't like it and being forced to be in it is a bad situation for a partner. So I think the harms to child are symmetric, because on either side you receive harms from abandonment. I don't think it's like mechanized or weighed in any way, like why the harms of abandonment are probably more than the harms of being in a relationship that is toxic. So I'm imagining that both of these harms are likely to be equally impactful, as far as how I saw this asserted in the debate, right? So the context here is you're going to have some harms on proposition where you don't leave these kind of relationships, like when you are in a friendship and you just leave these relationships. On opposition, there is also a harm that is from these people being forced to be in a relationship that is likely to be toxic over time because of the nature in which romance works, but also how it's likely to be harmful. So I do think that intensity is good on opposition. Prop tries to mitigate it through by talking about how there's chemicals in friendship as well, like you do have some other kind of associations. But what was slightly more persuasive to me about their response here was that you have multiple layers through which you can link to friendships, and you have just one romantic layer through which you link to relationship. The idea is Op does talk about how that romantic layer builds into further other connections, and that is why this argument is strong on Op. But I do think, given the consideration of other arguments that I think on my perception I weighed, on those considerations, I thought that affirmative was able to ace out this debate. I do think it was a really close round, though. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any, but this is my way.
Thanks so much.